Fast am I, hello and welcome to this edition of Agenda. I'm Ewan Gorn. The man who was governor at Strangeways during the longest prison riot in British history has written an account of his career. Brendan O'Friel has published a prison governor's journal exclusively on the Isle of Man. It charts his 30-year career working in the prison service of England and Wales and considers the impact of cell overcrowding and offender rehabilitation. There was a succession of post-war crises in the prison service, with overcrowding playing a role in creating poor conditions for staff and prisoners alike. Then came the challenges of drugs and those convicted of acts of terror. A prison governor with decades of experience, Brendan O'Friel, has examined these issues in his autobiographical work, A Prison Governor's Journal, published on the Isle of Man. We speak to him about these chronic problems, the riot at Strangeways, and what issues COVID poses for prisons. But first, starting from the start, Mr. O'Friel explained how he first came to the role.
I joined straight from university. I was at Liverpool University doing law. I did a 6-month training course and then set off on 8 different establishments was where I served. Well, it was 7, but I went to Strangeways twice, once just after I joined, and then I went back as governor. And I also did a number of jobs at prison service headquarters and at regional headquarters. So quite a varied career, and I was under lock and key for 33 years.
Why prisons?
Well, it all started with me going to Liverpool to read law and not being very fond of the idea of becoming either a solicitor, which seemed a bit sort of office bound, and barrister. Wasn't quite sure about the barrister bit. So I decided that I'd think again about teaching. Looked around at university, where could I go to sort of think sensibly about teaching. Ended up at Home Office approved schools, which were the only establishments open in the summers when I was sort of free to go and do things. Was so shocked by what I saw in the approved schools that I thought, I must do something about this.
So what shocked you before we move to the improvement?
Oh, right. What shocked me was I thought the kids were not at all well looked after. In some of the schools, it was chaos, and you could see there was a lot of bullying and violence going on. It was pretty horrific, actually. On the other hand, there were 1-2 schools that were actually quite good. So you got the idea that there was scope for doing things. And then, while I was brooding about these Home Office approved schools, the advert came up for assistant governors in the prison service. So I thought, that looks interesting career. It's the same sort of thing, dealing with offenders. So I applied, and they accepted me.
What was your perception of what the role would be, and how did that change when you started?
Oh, it was not at all clear what you'd be doing, other than you'd be assisting the governor. You'd be running a part of the prison, and in due course you'd probably become a deputy governor, and who knows, you might even become a governor in due course. But quite what it all involved, you weren't really terribly sure about. But they gave us a 6-month training course, which, although it missed lots of things they should have taught us, was quite useful. And I've used the book as to describe the course, because it's a way of introducing the reader to what the prison service was like in 1963, and a little bit of prison history and so forth.
Were there clear attitudes to how the job should be done then? And can you tell us a bit about those?
Not really. There was a lack of clarity, I would say, about what we were seeking to achieve. In the years between the wars, when there were only 10,000 people in prison, I think there was much more clarity about the training establishments and what they were trying to achieve. But from 1946 onwards, when overcrowding started, the prison service, I think, rather lost its way. And trying to manage this awful canker of overcrowding took up people's time. It took the eye, really, of those leading the service off other issues. And I think overcrowding is at the root of what went wrong with the prison service.
So did prisons become divorced from the social issues perhaps that you're referencing there? Do you think they were, out of sight, out of mind? They became political things that you could more people in prisons. It doesn't matter what they do when they come out or before they go in. Did that start to happen after sort of 1940s, as you referenced there?
Well, I don't think it's totally clear why the prison population has risen. I mean, you can see quite a lot of indications. If the media continues to go on and on about horrific crimes and the need to lock people up, that doesn't help. If the politicians decide that this is a good political story, that doesn't help. So there are those sort of factors that make quite a difference. There is the arrival of the drug scene. I mean, the drug scene just didn't exist in the 20s and 30s, and that's got progressively worse. And in recent years, since I've been retired, I mean, the stories I hear are horrendous of what they're having to deal with and put up with. But that's one example. The terrorist organisations, they've been around forever. I mean, if you go back to the 19th century, there was the Irish problems in parts of England. But the terrorist organisations, as we knew them, really came out of the Irish troubles from, say, 68, 69 onwards, and then some of the Middle East issues around hostage taking of planes and that sort of thing. And suddenly life became much more complicated and difficult.
So in what way?
Well, because we were getting people who were not, as the Northern Irish prison service used to say, not ordinary decent criminals, but people who've got a completely different approach. They're fanatics, if you like, really, and therefore dealing with them is a whole new ball game. And that was a complication that we were certainly not ready for. And of course, the whole thing continued to be compounded by the overcrowding of prisons. The numbers just seemed to keep on going up. And as I've said before, the senior people in the service almost seem to have lost the plot about the need to bring the staff on with them. And we lost the staff somewhere in the 50s and 60s. And it was not until about 1980, the late 1980s, that we really recovered from that. So we had industrial action, and some of that industrial action led to riots. It was awful.
So was it pay or training or numbers? What were the...
It's a whole series of things. For prison officers, their pay was grossly over-dependent on overtime, which led to manipulation because they had to try and keep their earnings levels up from their perspective. Because of the overcrowding, the job satisfaction was lost because staff had to be deployed out to the courts in large numbers. They had to be swapped around different establishments. I've gone into it in considerable detail in the book because it's quite complex. But the prison service just didn't handle it right and didn't recognise the mess it was getting into early enough. And it took quite a long time to get us out of that mess.
Of course, in the book, people will want to find out about 1990 and Strangeways. What you've been talking about, the issues you've identified through that period there, did they culminate into what we saw, or was that too simplistic?
Oh, that's too simplistic. I mean, the Strangeways riot has been extensively examined by the Wolf Inquiry, and the factors that played a part in it are itemised and so forth. And of course, a huge part of that was the overcrowding and the very poor conditions, which generated a feeling of resentment in prisoners, which was justifiable because the conditions were awful. Make no bones about it, and they were awful for the staff. So, in a sense, we should have seen it coming. But the actual riot, handling that was very difficult. the story of it's all there. There's about 5 chapters devoted to the run-up to the riot and the aftermath, as well as the riot itself. I think people will find it an interesting read, because this is really what happened.
How quickly did it all go for you on the ground? Did this go in a blink of an eye, these events, or...?
No, not really. The 33 years I was in the service, I make no bones about it. I enjoyed very much of it. I mean, there were some awful moments, like the Strangeways riot, particularly the first day or two, and one or two other things around the riot. But, I mean, the 5 years I spent at Risley were fascinating, rewarding, jolly hard work, but the response of both the staff and the prisoners was so encouraging, and that's what makes me convinced that there is far more we can do if we only go about things the right way.
Well, did you take Strangeways with you when you went to Risley? And Risley, from what I read, was in a similarly poor condition. Did you have a sort of reformist zeal after Strangeways to make sure Risley improved?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, the reformist zeal goes back a long way, and you'll
So was that always in you then?
Oh yeah. You'll see in the book how I was learning as I went along, as I became a deputy governor. How do we change things? How do we improve things? How do we learn to be a decent governor? And I take people through that as we go through the book. But when I got to Risley, obviously it was, I then had 27, 28 years of experience behind me, and that was obviously very helpful. But I also had a fair wind in some respects, and it's great to be able to pick up somewhere that's had a dreadful reputation, and a completely justified dreadful reputation, and to be able to turn it round the way we did.
I won't deprive potential readers of the details, so I won't go into this too much, but can you give me an indication of something you did learn in your career prior to Risley that you could then employ in the way you wanted correctly at Risley and ended up being a success?
Well, I think much of what I try and get over in the book is the importance of treating both staff and prisoners properly. If staff have got decent conditions of service, if they've got proper jobs, if prisoners have got challenging programs that we can put them into, whether it's learning to read for the illiterate or learning to be a skill under the NVQ programs that we had at Risley, those were all really good things.
You're listening to Agenda on Manx Radio. On this episode, we're interviewing former prison governor Brendan O'Friel, who's written a book about his decades-long career in jails across the UK. We have to draw you on today's prisons. I mean, how do you think they're faring against what you've been talking about?
Well, one of the reasons why I wrote the book, or completed the book to be exact, was from 2010 onwards, the prison service, which had made some progress up till then, went into sharp decline because the budgets were cut drastically and all sorts of new problems started to emerge. And I think the prison service went seriously downhill for a number of years. And when the pandemic struck, many people were really concerned that many prisoners would die of COVID. And prison service deserves huge credit for at least preventing those deaths. But it's been at a price. The price has been they've had to keep people very restricted, and with the sort of people who are in prison, we have no idea really how much damage those restrictions will have done in the longer term. And it's interesting that the Chief Inspector of Prisons has produced a report this February on how really the prison service has coped with that first wave of the pandemic, because this was obviously before the second wave, and has expressed real concern about what the long-term impact is going to be.
On the Isle of Man, there was a period in which the prison had to employ a regime that some advocates criticised. Would you have liked to have been, well, probably not, would you have liked to have been a governor when COVID was happening? How do you think you would have dealt with that?
I think I take my hat off to all those who were working in the prisons throughout this period. I think they've had a huge challenge, quite unprecedented, and they deserve our thanks for getting through in the way that they have. Whether the regimes that have been mounted were the best, we don't know. I'm sure there'll be a big review of this in due course. What I do hope is that we can get back to a focus and attention upon improving prisoners so that when they leave prison, they don't reoffend.
Well, that's the theme that I've taken from your conversations, is that without prisons being done properly, we can end up perpetuating these social issues, perpetuating crime. What do you think decision makers are aware of that? Do you think they think, right, if the prison is sorted, then these other issues, they'll be alleviated? Do you think they understand that relationship?
No, part of the problem is that if you look back, you'll see that prison ministers come and go in the UK like, sort of several a year in some cases. And it was always us. I can remember exactly the same problem. So that new politicians coming in had to be briefed, and the prison service is quite a complicated organisation, and changing it can be quite difficult. I did like the most recent prisons minister over here, who's just been reported in the press as saying that he wants prisoners called prisoners, and I entirely agree with him. I think prisoners or offenders are entirely appropriate comments rather than residents or clients or something. So I would go along with him there. But I would say the really important thing is the relationship between staff and prisoners, and you've got to organise the prison so that there is good continuity, so that prisoners and staff get to know each other and that positive relationships can develop, so that you can diffuse tensions and you can promote the prisoners developing the sort of programmes that I've been talking about.
Other countries have different models for prisons. Is there anything that's caught your eye as an attractive or interesting proposal there?
Well, if you look at the States, it's appalling. They lock up far more than we do. But if you look at, say, Scandinavia, for example, or the Netherlands, they're much more selective with who's sent to prison, and they have much more, that gives them much more opportunity to develop skills and to deal with issues that can be improved by programs. Let me give you an example of that, which is a very obvious one. Anger management. Some people have great difficulty controlling their emotions and get very angry very quickly. We've been running anger management programs for years in prisons, and they can be really quite effective. And I saw that with my own eyes at Risley, where you could see prisoners who were difficult in the prison becoming not perfect, but easier for the staff to manage. And the staff who got real skills at improving anger management, they were often called to deal with the difficult situations, and they developed terrific skill at calming people down. And that's the sort of example of the sort of thing we need to be doing much more of.
You mentioned how terrorism and then the war on drugs both shaped prisons. We are hearing more and more about mental health. I mean, maybe it's always been there and this is just a recognition of what we're seeing, but certainly we know the police are having to deal with mental health much more, and then by extension the prisons. How big of an issue do you see that those services are having to deal with that issue?
Oh, it's a huge problem. In the book, I quote the fact that 70% of prisoners have got one or more mental health problems. It's a fact of life. And in very overcrowded prisons, dealing with mental health issues as well, it's a nightmare. In somewhere like Risley, where we had good conditions and we had challenging programs, lots of opportunities for dealing with people as individuals, you could deal with them much more easily. And there was some prospect of making progress, but you need more resources in terms of nurses with mental health skills to deal with the more acute cases of mental illness. But it's a huge problem for the prison service. If you remember, if you look back sort of decades ago, we used to incarcerate lots and lots of people in mental hospitals. That wasn't the right thing to do, these big old mental hospitals. We closed them, and we've got different sorts of units now, but some of the more difficult and challenging people cannot be accommodated in mental health units, and therefore they end up in prison. And that's even more inappropriate.
Well, bringing us back, of course, to the reason we're having this chat, the book, why did you decide to write it now? Because you're not just retired.
No. The book was sort of developed over a good number of years, and a key point in it was 2015, when I was involved with producing the 25th anniversary programme about Strangeways and the riot. And as a result of seeing that, some of my older grandchildren, late teenagers, started asking me questions, and I thought, I've got to get this story down. So I got writing. And then the pandemic came along, and frankly, as soon as I saw what was going to happen, I thought, I've got to finish that book, because there's things that need saying, and the prison service is going to be in such difficulty. Prisoners are going to be in such very difficult conditions. Staff are going to have huge challenges. So that sort of got me going, and I got it done, and here it is. And what I must say is, of course, it is Noel Manx production. It's been written on the island. The artwork's from an island firm. The proofreading's been done by somebody on the island. It's being sold through island outlets, and of course it was actually printed down in Port St Mary by Quine and Covens.
I want to ask you, since you've publicised this, has anybody from your past reached out to you to talk about some of the things you've written, or to sort of just catch up? And
Oh yeah, I mean, I've had a huge number of contacts from people, but to be fair, I initiated some of those because I wanted people to be aware this was coming out, because I was using material, for example, from Risley, which they'd contributed to, and I didn't want it to sort of come to them casually. I wanted to say, look, this is what I'm doing, and this book will be coming out. But no, it's been really very heartening, the number of people who said this is a very interesting account.
There are perhaps two ways to read this book: as a fascinating account of your career, but it's also, as you've mentioned, a sort of a warning or a guide for policymakers. Do you hope that it is read as that, as something that can inform what we're going to do in the future?
It's got several strands to it, the book. The book is an account of what went on, and it really starts, most of it is from 1946 onwards, and it gets much more detailed from 1963 onwards. So it's a history. But within that history, there are some exciting stories, like the Strangeways riot. There are some analysis of what went wrong, like my descriptions about overcrowding, how it happened, the impact of overcrowding, the staff problems, the industrial action, the industrial relations issues. Those are given separate chapters. So for the reader, there are going to be bits that you may not be terribly interested in. But I think the overall impression will be, I hope, very something that they will enjoy, and something that will make them think. If people read the book and come out saying, I didn't realise it was quite like that, it's been worth doing.
That's all from this programme. We'll be back with more from Agenda soon, and you can listen again to this edition online via the Manx Radio website as a podcast or through Spotify. But for now, Guramayu and goodbye.